afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Octo Consulting webinar on cloud computing. My name is Ashok Nare. I'm the principal and practice lead for the Technology and Solutions practice. So just a quick logistical thing to get it out of the way. You may not be able to ask any questions on the phone during the webinar. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to use the GoToWebinar software itself to ping some of our moderators for your questions, and we'll make sure we answer it either on the phone or via the software itself. So evolution and not a revolution. How cloud computing builds on traditional IT strategy and delivery models. The basic assumption we're making here is that all of you are aware of what a cloud is, understand the fundamental concept of a cloud, and understand the different models the cloud offers and different benefits the cloud brings to us. I'm assuming that's why we're all here, trying to understand what makes us successful and what do we need to do to go to a cloud and be successful on a cloud. And what are the different things we have to do to our traditional IT strategy and delivery models to make sure that we're aligned well to some of the cloud computing models. So that would be the primary theme of our webinar today. So to quickly run through the agenda, we're going to talk about some key takeaways. Hopefully we can all walk away with a clear understanding of those key takeaways at the end of the webinar. We'll quickly set some context in terms of what an evolution versus a revolution is. We'll touch on what a cloud is. We'll look at a brief definition, and we'll touch on what we mean by traditional IT and IT strategy and delivery models. We'll look at evolution of cloud computing, drivers and enablers, and also start talking about some of the barriers for adoption of cloud computing. Then we will look into IT strategy and delivery models that we've been using over the past few years, and how they either need to be changed or are changing to account for some of the changes cloud computing is bringing to us right now. And we'll wrap that up with some conclusions. So the first key takeaway here is cloud computing is an evolution and not a revolution. But of course, that depends on where you're starting from. And I will expand more on that as we go through the next set of slides here. And the next takeaway is that strong fundamentals and maturity in traditional IT strategy and delivery models can reduce the chasm a organization has to cross in order to be successful with cloud computing. Again, we will be digging a little bit deeper into this concept in the coming slides as well. And finally, what do we need to have in place in order to be successful with cloud? That is a unified approach to improving maturity along multiple dimensions. Again, the key here is multiple dimensions, and that is critical to a successful adoption of cloud computing for an organization. So what is the difference between a revolution and evolution? So let's set some context there. So evolution is incremental, it is slow, it's reliable, it's continuous, and it happens all the time. So as we speak, evolution is happening on multiple fronts. Even if we just focus on technology, I'm sure evolution is happening incrementally on several fronts there. Revolution, in stark contrast, is very rapid, it's sporadic, and it can lead to an idea that is revolutionary, can lead to a failure or a huge success, depending on how great that idea is, and a lot of other things that go into it, such as technology enablers and some of the other business and market drivers are in place at that point, at the point the idea was conceived. So that is the primary difference between an evolution and revolution, and it's good to set the context as we explore whether the cloud computing area is an evolution or a revolution. Now, what are traditional IT strategy and delivery models? Let's explore a few of them that we're going to touch on today. The first one we're going to talk about is Architect. Architect basically deals with developing a target state for your cloud solution using enterprise solution architecture. So effectively is dealing with the practice of enterprise architecture within your organization. It's setting the goal, setting the strategy for, and the vision for your overall solution, including cloud within that solution. Fund. Fund is basically dealing with how do I determine which capabilities I want to take to the cloud, and what kind of solutions I want to use for the cloud, and how do I pay for them. So once we set a vision using the architect model, we want to start looking at how do I fund that vision to move forward. And the third model we're going to look into is acquire. So once we figure out what solution we want to put in place and we figured out how we can fund it, now it's time to acquire the necessary resources to make sure it, make sure it happens, make sure that we can deliver that particular vision. So this is where we start looking at what kind of service providers we can acquire, what are the SLAs and incentives we need to put in place, and how do I manage performance, and so on and so forth. And the next step we're going to look at is manage. So once I figure out what I want to do, I funded it, I acquire the resources, now I want to make sure I can execute and I can manage the whole execution process effectively to make sure that I'm transitioning to the cloud effectively. And finally, deliver. Deliver is really where the rubber meets the road. We've done all of these great things, but at the end of the day, we need to make sure the vision we set forth for ourselves, we're able to deliver via actionable results. And that means whether it's via setting up the proper infrastructure, setting up the proper platforms, application development, so on and so forth, and effectively delivering the results for the organization. So we will be using this framework as we move forward here when we talk about traditional IT strategy and delivery model. This is the model we're referencing. So what is a cloud? There have been so many definitions of cloud, and obviously the definition from NIST is the most popular. But what we've done here is, instead of going with the definition of NIST, which is a little bit too long, we basically simplified, and in simple layman terms, cloud computing is on-demand IT services provided by a black box service provider. So that pretty much covers what you get from the different models you saw in the NIST definition: infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. And obviously, there are some essential characteristics to a cloud. What makes a cloud different from, let's say, a managed data center? Broad network access, rapid elasticity, measured service, on-demand self-service, and resource pooling. Again, we've all seen these definitions before. Finally, there are 4 different types of deployment models, starting from a private to community to hybrid to public type of deployment of clouds. And we're also, all of us are, I'm sure, familiar with the benefits. That's partly why we're looking into potentially moving some of our services to the cloud. Increased business agility, elasticity obviously gives us on-demand scalability. Whenever we need scalability, we can scale up or down. Rapid provisioning of services, so we don't have to wait 6 months or a year to get that big server into our infrastructure. Pay-as-you-go model, obviously, because of the economies of scale cloud brings to the table, we're able to reduce our capital investments, and also by using the meter services model, we're able to pay as we go. So again, real quick, a very high-level definition of cloud and some of the benefits of the cloud to set some context here. So evolution of cloud computing. So if we go back all the way to the 1950s and bring it all the way to the current day, which is about 2011, 2012, what are all the different things that happened that led to where we are today? If we look at it purely from an architecture perspective, we've gone, we came from a mainframe-based computing to desktop, client-server, distributed, all the way to cloud-based computing models. But looking at it slightly differently, though, back in 1950s, the terms or the concepts of cloud and grid was actually predicted in 1960s by 2 scientists by name John McCarthy and Douglas Parkhill. And over a period of time, that led to the next evolution in the computing models, if you will, which is ARPANET. The first massive grid was set up in 1969. And in 1990, the concept of grid computing was popularized again. The first grid was started in 1969, but it took a few years for the concept of grid to become popular. Around the 1990s area, you have a lot of scientific and academic and mathematical communities using grids primarily for heavy parallel processing type of computations. And next comes the era of what I call application service provider. In the mid-1990s, there was a concept called application service provider, which actually offered software as a service, but it had a flawed model on the business side, so it didn't go anywhere. But around the 2000 timeframe, you had Salesforce.com actually offered the very first software as a service on the internet. It's really their CRM software. They offered using the model of software as a service. But what are some of the enablers? What really made this transition happen? We've seen the client-server computing pick up from the mainframe desktop. We moved on to distributed computing, web-based computing. A lot of standards have been defined. HTTP, XML have been standardized around the early to mid-1990s. All of this evolution actually led to Salesforce.com, for example, again, just one vendor, coined the term or at least begin the inception of software as a service model. Some of the other enablers are basically, we all know service-oriented architecture has been pretty prevalent over the past few years. Virtualization is really one of the key innovations that enabled cloud, and that happened in the early 2000s. And you have web services, middleware, and ESPs, and if you see how the progression of technology happened over a period of time, we had constant elevation of abstraction that really led us to where we are today. Just point out one vendor, Amazon EC2, Elastic Cloud, and S3 services were announced in 2006. And after that, you had several vendors, including Microsoft and Google, that are in the market right now, along with several other cloud providers that are providing cloud services to us. And again, one of the other enablers is the whole concepts of Web 2.0, social media, Enterprise 2.0, and most importantly, the maturity of some of these standards, like virtualization, like service-oriented architecture, web services, really pushed the evolution all forward and got us to where we are today. And if we look at the drivers, what really made the organization, the federal agencies, stop and take a look at the market? If you look at one of the drivers that happened in the early to mid-2000s is the whole concept of performance-based acquisition and establishment of true SLAs. Again, that's a major change in the process in how we acquire services that made the organizations or federal agencies to stop and take a look at the market and say, hey, what is out there that we can leverage to make this happen? And some of the latest modern-day drivers here, some of the federal mandates, such as 24-point plan, and based on the current economy right now, everybody's looking to cut costs. Everybody's looking to be more agile. We want to be able to react to changing market conditions, political conditions much quickly than we are today. And some of the other initiatives, such as centralization of IT, data center consolidation, so on and so forth. So these are all market drivers that are forcing us to reevaluate the technology we're using and look at cloud as a way to solve some of the issues we're facing on the organization side. Now, where do we go from here? So we obviously don't know what comes after cloud in the thread of evolution, and there could be more enablers that come along the way. There could be more drivers that come along the way, depending on our political, economic, and cultural environments, depending on how they go over the next few years. But so to summarize, for cloud computing, the business drivers are basically do more with less, business agility, on-demand scalability, and federal mandates. Some of the business drivers. If you look at some of the technology enablers, you have grid computing, distributed computing, standardization of technology, service and architecture, virtualization. Just like any other technology that we've seen in the history, take a service and architecture or any other technology that came before cloud computing, there are always barriers. And I think more so with cloud computing, because of some of the transformational elements that it brings to the table, there are a lot of barriers that organizations are facing when they at least start exploring the concept or try to move to the cloud. So some of the barriers that we can explore here are security and privacy. Some of it is really perception of lack of security. Based on some of the arguments you hear in the market, there is a certain level of perception of lack of security in the market. Division of operational responsibility. So when your IT is handling all of your application development hosting for you, the operational responsibility lies within your IT. But when we start looking at operations as different services and we start bringing cloud providers, all of a sudden you have to start dividing your operational responsibility, and there has to be a way to collaborate over these responsibilities. Consumption-based pricing and evaluation. This was a need when service owner architecture was in full swing, but even more so, very critical for a cloud provider or an organization seeking a cloud provider to be able to do consumption-based pricing and evaluation. And lack of service owner architecture. What I really mean by service-oriented architecture here is not purely from a technology perspective. This is actually more from a business perspective. So even though we have services on the technology side, if our business is not organized by capabilities or services they can offer to the marketplace, it would be very hard for a business to start thinking of what services and capabilities that I can actually outsource, quote unquote, outsource to the cloud. Inability or unwillingness to give up control. This is again an important one and goes goes a little bit to the culture of several of our organizations, where when you go with a service or a capability-based model, you are giving up a little bit a certain level of control over your program, if you will, because you are losing some functionality or in terms of services and capabilities that are moving to the cloud. So that could be a significant barrier in organizations that are trying to move to the cloud. And the last two are also very important. The governance structure. What kind of governance structure do I need to put around managing these cloud providers? How do I make sure I have my SLAs covered and I have my business continuity assured for me? And performance and accountability. So we also need, once we acquire the services of a cloud provider, once we get over the hurdle of acquiring the service of a cloud provider, what kind of measures and metrics do we need to put in place? What kind of processes do we need to put in place to make sure that the provider is performing to the SLAs that we set forward for them? So how do we break through these barriers? And we talked about the traditional IT and strategy models early on. So the way we break through these barriers is by evaluating where we are in each one of these models. For example, architects, how do we develop the target state? Fund, how do we fund our solution? And acquire, how do we acquire the services that are needed to execute the solution? How do we manage and execute the solution? How do we deliver the solution, right? So what we need to do in order to break through these barriers is to evaluate where we are in each one of these disciplines and figure out where we need to go and how far we need to go and what are the changes we need to make in each one of these disciplines to break through those barriers. So on the next slide, what we're going to see is, basically in the next set of slides, what we're going to see is we're going to walk through each one of those disciplines we just looked at and look at what happened over the period of time and what kind of evolution has taken place in each one of these disciplines. Where are we today, and what do we need to do to make sure that we are ready for the cloud? So if you look at the x-axis, we're talking about architecture evolution. So this is enterprise architecture and solution architecture evolution over a period of time. And on the y-axis, you'll see cloud readiness. The very first thing that happened was, when there was no formal EA practices in place, the EA practice itself was very technology focused. What that means is there was a little too much focus on technology and lack of focus on information and business architectures. And there was also a huge gap between enterprise architecture office, if you will, and solution architecture, or even one level below solution architecture, where you can actually take some of the policies and guidance given by the EA and make sure that you're executing at the lowest levels, there was a huge gap between the two. And there was also lack of standard reference architectures when we have a technology-focused EA program. Now, next we had business-focused EA programs where the focus was more on the business and IT alignment, and there was better understanding of enterprise information needs, and there was also better policy and governance structure that was driven by the architecture. There was also an introduction of segment architecture, and you see an explosion of frameworks in this area, including Zachman, FEA, TOGAF, DODAF, etc. A lot of these frameworks cover not just the technology area. They make sure that they take a holistic view and a perspective of, let's make sure we're looking at technology, business, and information and architectures at the same time, and setting policies and procedures for the whole organizations with a holistic view. Now, what do we need to have in place to move to the next layer? So we need to go to a more of a service and capability-focused view of EA. We need to focus on services and capabilities. We need to, there is going to be even more important role or relevance for enterprise architecture programs to play in the coming days, because EA will effectively play the glue between technology and business. So for example, it's not enough to introduce the concept of services and capabilities at the technical level or at the IT level, but we also need to make sure we are doing the same thing on the business side and they are aligned well together so that at the end of the day, the IT is meeting the business needs. Some of the other things we also have to start looking at is looking at the cloud standards, some of the reference architectures that are coming out on NIST, for example. There are several other standards bodies in place right now. So those are some of the changes we need to start making to our EA programs to make sure that we're in line with the market, we're in line with the standards that are coming out. And more importantly, I think we need to be more agile and more iterative. If you look at some of the EA programs from the past, most of them failed because you had too long of a cycle for defining a target state, for example, and there was a huge gap between enterprise and solution architecture. So if we go with more of an agile and iterative approach, we can make sure that we can set that target state much quicker. We can also execute the target state much more quickly than we are right now. And one of the tenets of agile is if we're going to fail, let's fail early so that we can make we can correct our course based on the feedback. So one other thing I wanted to point out here is, depending on where you are in this path of evolution, if you will, the chasm to cross or the leap an organization has to make may be small or it may be too large. So for example, if we want to go from, if there is an organization that's already doing the business-focused EA very well and it's an established EA program, moving to the next level to go from a business focus to a service and capability focus is going to be much easier than going from, say, technology-focused EA program to service and capability-focused EA program. That would be a much longer leap for us, for an organization to make. Now, if we move to the next slide, we're going to start looking at funding the solution. On the bottom x-axis, you'll see how portfolio management or capital planning function has evolved over a period of time, and we have the cloud readiness on the y-axis, as just very similar to the previous picture. So in the early days, we had more of an ad hoc portfolio management approach to this function. There was limited or incomplete visibility into the portfolio, and it was also very reactive. So at any given point, a CIO or a CTO would not be able to look into the portfolio and say, hey, these are all the applications I have, and these are the risks I'm carrying right now. This is the plan I need to have in place to mitigate those risks. And the next evolution was application-based portfolio management, where the granularity is more of applications. What that gives is it gives you total visibility into your applications, gives you the risk profiles of each of your applications. You understand the value, the true value each application is bringing to your business, and the true cost each application is bringing to your business, and you're able to make educated decisions based on their portfolio, and compared to ad hoc, you have much more insight and knowledge into your IT operations using this type of portfolio management approach. So where do we need to go from here to make sure that we are marching forward in line with some of the goals that are out there for cloud computing? Is again, going back to the service model, we need to make sure we go to more of a service portfolio management approach, where the granularity services instead of applications. And we may still have to look at applications, but we need to take that one level higher and start looking at service and our capabilities, and look at the dependencies that exist between services and applications. Another important aspect that we also need to look at is the chargeback models. How do we handle the capitalization, if you will, of different services, whether they are outsourced from us or that we are providing to somebody as a service in a cloud? So what are the different funding models we can use in there to compensate for the division of responsibilities, if you will? Similar story here is if you need to make a jump from an application portfolio management layer to a service portfolio management layer, it's a much smaller jump compared to going from an ad hoc to a service portfolio management layer. So depending on where you are in the path of evolution, your jump or chasm to cross, if you will, would be smaller or bigger. So the next one we're going to start talking about is acquired services. This is your acquisitions function, which I think is a very critical one that we need to look at. We have the acquisition evolution on the x-axis and cloud readiness on the y. And if you look at the traditional way acquisition was done, it was done based on statements of work. In the statements of work, the solution was overly prescribed. When it went to the market, there were lots of SLAs that were set in place. There was more of a mentality of win-lose. If somebody has to lose in order for the other party to win. So either the service provider has to lose or the organization has to lose. So in this model, the quality obviously suffered because nobody likes to lose at the end of the day. So then came performance-based acquisition. As we pointed out in the evolution slide, the performance-based acquisition looked at things slightly differently. Instead of issuing statements of work that prescribed the solution, it was more requirements-driven and asked for a solution, asked the market to provide a solution for the organization. There were more focused SLAs than lots of SLAs in play from a compliance and performance management perspective. And there was also a increased rigor or mature process around performance measurement, because that basically is a feedback loop for your acquisition strategy. And the key thing to look at here is, compared to the traditional acquisition model, which is a win-lose model, we have a win-win model here where both the organization and the service provider are guaranteed to have a win, in the sense everybody is contributing to the solution, which effectively will give the organization a quality solution to move forward with, instead of somebody having to sacrifice some things. The next phase that organizations potentially have to go to is what Octo has been observing in the market over the past few months, is what we call agile acquisition. Basically, agile acquisition deals with the ability to acquire services really quickly and iteratively. And this is different from the way acquisition has been done traditionally, and even to some extent with the PBA model, because you can't afford to procure a service and wait for procurement of service for 6 months or a year. You have to be able to procure them quickly, and you have to be able to procure them in smaller increments. This is where the agility comes into play. And you also need to start looking at consumption-based pricing and evaluation. So this is also a difference from the previous acquisition models, where we have to start looking at how we consume, and especially when we go with the pay-as-you-go model, we have to start developing structures and processes to be able to do consumption-based pricing and evaluation, and also having frameworks to evaluate service providers. For example, accounting for or taking into account frameworks or organizations such as FedRAMP that evaluates cloud providers from a security perspective. And I think it's also important to develop a level of trust with the service providers because we're going with more of a service-based approach and we're acquiring services quickly and iteratively. So same concept here. If you look at where you are as an organization, if an organization is doing traditional acquisition model, obviously the leap would be much longer. But we have seen organizations, we are actually currently working with a federal agency that we helped establish a PBA program, a performance-based acquisition program. And now as they start looking at how to procure some of the cloud services and mobile services, they're able to make the transition very easily because they already have some of the maturity in place from the establishment of performance-based acquisition models. Now on the next slide, we're going to start looking at the manage portion. What do we need to have in place from a program management perspective, and what happened for program management over the years? If you look at the early part of program management or project management, there was a definite lack of formal processes and structure approach. The management was very reactive, but over the years, there's been very strong maturity in this discipline. You have a very strong proactive management principles and frameworks. You have mature standardized processes. You have PMP and PMBOK. There's a lot of literature and research done in this area. So from a program management perspective, a lot of the evolution that happened over the years contributes to the next step, is really contributing to managing cloud-based deployments or cloud-based solutions, if you will. The only add-on I might add is that program management or project management has to be more agile. So we need to run the program management offices or project management cycles using the agile principles, focus on iterative delivery and measuring progress iteratively and incrementally at every iteration. And also there has to be a huge focus on communications and collaboration. We are also working with another agency right now who is trying to move their email to Microsoft-based cloud solution, and they already had a very effective communication strategy as part of their PMO office. What we've done is we went in and we worked with the agency to enhance that communications program to better suit the needs of what we have to deal with the cloud computing in terms of barriers. So even here, depending on where you are in the path of evolution, we might be forced to make a smaller jump or a much larger jump to get to the agile way of delivering PMO or running PMO and project management offices. So the next slide we're going to talk about is delivering results. This is, again, as I mentioned earlier, where the rubber meets the road. We've done all this planning. We funded our programs and we acquired services and we put some management discipline in place. Now we have to deliver. What do we need to do to prepare for that? If you look at the evolution again, if you look at how some of the computing platforms have evolved over a period of time, we came from the monolithic client-server era where the applications are very siloed and the systems are very tightly coupled. And there were dedicated resources for each of these applications. For example, application A would have its own database, would be deployed on its own server. Irrespective of the amount of utilization the application is having on the particular server, we are dedicating the particular infrastructure to that specific application. And if you look at the next set of evolution, we have web-based architectures and service-oriented architectures, which gave us loosely coupled systems, gave us composite applications, but it also gave us the ability to go with more of a shared distributed infrastructure. So you can take a single server, host a web server, and have multiple web applications serving the needs of hundreds and thousands of users. So you're already seeing the evolution take place here, and you are going more from dedicated, centralized infrastructure to more of a shared distributed infrastructure models. And a lot of standards that are related to web and service-oriented architecture have matured over a period of time, and that's another part of that evolution that happened, which gave us, again, loosely coupled systems and composite applications and infrastructure sharing. Now, taking that one level forward to where we are today, in terms of cloud computing, what are some of the things that we need to account for from a delivery perspective? We have to start looking at our application architectures slightly differently. We have to start looking at the services that are offered by a cloud, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, because each one of them bring its own characteristics to the table that will change the design and architecture of an application. We need to start thinking about cloud-aware development and deployment tools so that we can actually work with these models of especially the platform as a service and software as a service models and integrate into the cloud with these models. And agile software development again becomes an important part as we looked at even other disciplines. Agility becomes important here also because you want to make sure that you are leveraging some of these services effectively, very quickly in smaller iterations, measuring the progress and your success or failure much quicker than traditional software development processes. And the same story here, if you, depending on where you are on the path of evolution, if we still have some client-server applications in the IT environment, it's going to be much harder jump to go to a cloud because you need the process of the separation of concerns, if you will, separating the services from your infrastructure and your data sources and so on and so forth is going to take much longer for you. But on the flip side, if you're already doing service-oriented architecture very effectively, you are halfway there. You are able to take those services at this point. The service, it doesn't matter where the services are deployed. They could be in the cloud or they could be on your own infrastructure. So it hides those details from you, and it's a much easier jump to go to a cloud than from a client-server environment. Now, to summarize what we just looked at, if we look at all of the different strategy and delivery models, architect, fund, acquire, manage, and deliver, and look at the maturity along each one of these dimensions. Is it enough to mature in one of the dimensions? Let's say, for example, I have an excellent EA program in place, but I have a not so great acquisition strategy in place. I'm not doing PBA right now. Is that going to enable me to go to cloud very effectively? Perhaps not. So the purpose of this slide here is to show you that you need to be able to execute or improve the maturity of an organization along multiple disciplines, multiple IT strategy and delivery models. So for example, let's say our current state is on the left-hand side here, the marked by the teal color here, and your target state is somewhere along the way on the right-hand side. And the gap between the two is really your chasm to cross. So this is for an organization, this is the maturity chasm to cross depending on where an organization is today and where they want to go. And where they want to go depends on what type of capabilities you want to leverage from the cloud. For example, you might want to just do infrastructure as a service, or you might want to use the cloud for storage only, or you might want to actually go to the next level, do platform as a service, software as a service. So basically what that means is the higher up the stack you go, the more maturity you need to have in place to be successful in those cloud deployments. So effectively, the chasm to cross for an organization in order to be successful in a cloud environment depends on where an organization is and what they want to do on the cloud and where that particular target level of maturity is among these 5 different dimensions. So what this requires us to do when we look at these 5 different IT strategy and delivery models is, as I mentioned, it may not get us too far if we improve the maturity in one dimension or not in the other dimensions. So we need to start looking at all of these dimensions together. We need to have a unified, more of a life cycle approach with feedback loops going back and forth among all of these disciplines. And we need to start weaving them together with other concerns that almost any technology brings to the table, such as organization. What kind of organizational changes do I need to make to better leverage what the cloud has to offer for me? What kind of governance structure do I need to have in place to measure the performance of the cloud providers? What do I need to optimize any processes across all of these disciplines to make sure that I'm leveraging 100% of what the cloud has to offer? And performance management also becomes very critical because you need to be able to not just acquire the services of these providers, but also be able to measure the performance and set up the right metrics and measures in place to do so. And security, obviously, it goes without saying, is that it's one of the critical parts of your cloud strategy, and it spans pretty much all of your strategy and delivery models. We just did not dig too deep into it, primarily because it's not the focus of the webinar today, but make no mistake that security is definitely an important characteristic you would consider in each one of these disciplines. So, in conclusion, if you remember the opening remarks we had, the key takeaways, one of the key takeaway to reiterate is adoption of the cloud can be a revolution or an evolution for an organization depending on the current maturity level of the organization along the multiple dimensions we just looked at. Strong fundamentals and maturity in our traditional IT strategy and delivery models will definitely reduce the chasm to cross or the leap an organization needs to make to be successful in the cloud environment. And finally, a unified approach that is a lifecycle model with good feedback loops to improve maturity along the multiple disciplines we looked at is very critical to successful cloud adoption. So with that, we conclude this webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is up here. My email address is up here as well. Obviously, you can also go to octaconsulting.com. That's your main website. But please feel free to reach out to me. Okay, so we have some questions. So we're going to go into some question and answers right now. So the question is, can you explain why having experience with SOA is important to moving to cloud? That's an excellent question and one of my favorites. Because having experience with SOA gives you the ability to think in terms of services. So if you look at cloud, for example, I think, let me back up a little bit. One key remark I need to make here is it also depends on what you want to do with the cloud. So for example, all we want to do is just move our archival strategy to the cloud, or have storage in the cloud, or just leverage infrastructure as a service. Perhaps it may not be that big of a problem, but especially when we start going into platform as a service and the software as a service, and we have a heterogeneous environment where we have some applications that are highly secure and need to be within the boundary, if you will, and some services are being procured externally. This is where experience with service architecture is going to become very critical. So if you remember what happened with SOA, you can obviously have break up your application functionality into multiple services. And if you've already done that, it's easier to take the next step or go to the next level of taking these services and either deploying it onto a cloud provider using the infrastructure as a service model, or even taking the service implementation and using somebody else's implementation. Let's say there's a SaaS provider out there that are providing the same service for you. It will be easy enough to make that jump for you at that point. So on top of that, a lot of lessons learned, I think, that came from the SOA environment are extremely valuable in the cloud computing area. And these two are definitely complementary technologies and have to work together. The next question is, how does the government make use of capital investments that have already occurred for the data centers while also moving to the cloud with a long-term strategy? Okay. One way to do this is move to the cloud slowly with targeted services that make sense. Again, going back to what I said, maybe you start with capabilities that are pretty straightforward to move. Maybe email, storage, archival, so on and so forth. So you start slowly and move those services to the cloud, leaving existing architecture in place for the key functions of your business. So again, here we need to make sure we are working with the cloud and dipping our toes in the waters, if you will, and test the waters and make sure that we build confidence in the cloud before we make heavy investments into that architecture and infrastructure. Yeah. So the next question is, with a distributed architecture already in place, what advantages does the cloud offer? Good question. So again, distributed architecture is great. If you're already using a distributed architecture, distributed environment, you're already, like I said early on in the presentation, you're halfway or more than halfway there. Going back to what I said earlier about even service-oriented architecture, what distributed architecture gives you is that next step of evolution, where you can, instead of using a consolidated infrastructure resource that you have and you own, you can actually go to the cloud. You can deploy the same distributed resources. Let's just talk about resources in that case, or services or capabilities. You can deploy them on a cloud provider instead of deploying on your own infrastructure. And of course, the assumption here is that you recognize the benefits that going to a cloud brings to the table. Even if we have a consolidated infrastructure in place that enables distributed architecture, we can very well move to the cloud and reduce that capital investment and move to an operational costs, and leverage the same distributed architecture that is in place. Of course, again, going back to what I said, all of this has to happen slowly over a period of time. We're obviously not going to move all of the service and capabilities directly into the cloud. We will. Our recommendation will be to move the non-high impact services or capabilities into the cloud, build confidence, and slowly move to the next steps. All right, next question is, how do we address the issue of inability or unwillingness to give up control? That's a good question again, and one of the, as I mentioned, one of the bigger challenges that you probably will face in an organization. I would say one of the critical things that needs to happen is establishment of an organizational change management initiative, because we really need to start getting folks to understand that the benefits, what are the benefits to the centralization of capabilities. And this also leads into one of the comments I made earlier about effective communication and marketing strategies. So we're actually working with a customer right now that's actually moving more from a client-server environment to a distributed architecture. They're not to the cloud yet. But it's important to point out that they are facing exactly the same challenge. There is resistance. There is unwillingness to give up control on programs. What we're doing there is we're putting together an effective communication and marketing strategy, effectively treat our effort, our architecture modernization effort as a marketing effort, and put a marketing and communication strategy around to better educate people. And obviously that's one component of it. There's going to be another component that is political, which most of us may or may not have much, too many answers for. Next question is, how do you deal with data migration to the cloud? So it depends on what we mean by data migration to the cloud, because are we talking about moving just the storage? Are we talking about moving our data sources? In order to move our data sources to the cloud, obviously, going back to my earlier comment, I would argue that you need to have effective distributed architecture, either a distributed architecture in place as part of your solution architecture, or an effective solution, a service-oriented architecture in place as part of your solution architecture. But if the answer is we're moving purely data, as in we're using the cloud as storage for storage, then it's important to understand the data policies. What are the retention policies, for example? Is the storage need to be only there for a few weeks, few months, few years. What is that going to cost me? Because just moving to the cloud is obviously not free. What kind of numbers are we looking at? Other part you want to look at is privacy and security. So if there is a certain level of privacy requirements for your data, it may or may not be applicable for a public cloud. And we know some agencies are looking at public clouds, and some agencies are looking at private clouds, obviously. So depending on the requirement for the data, you would leverage the right architectural framework within the cloud. Is there such a thing as interoperability between clouds, and does an organization have to have a single cloud in order to be effective? Good question again, and there is such a thing as interoperability between clouds. We don't think that it's practical to have a single cloud provider for all of your services. You might, even from a competition perspective, right? Your acquisition model may not support that. You may have different cloud providers that are providing services for you, and it's very, very, very important to make sure that you are able to port your solution from one cloud provider to another, and also there is interoperability between the two or multiple clouds you're using. This is an area that is evolving right now. There are a lot of standards that are being defined. It's relatively mature. So I would say, depending on which cloud provider you're with, you'll probably have some sort of vendor lock-in at this point. But once the standards are in place with several standards bodies in work at the moment, hopefully the portability and interoperability issues between and among clouds would be solved. Next question is, how conducive is cloud computing with highly classified applications, and what challenges do you see in that area? Good question again. It really depends on, again, going back to what you said, it's classification of the application. What you would want to do in that case, if an application is highly classified, the first thing I know a lot of agencies are looking at is the use of private clouds, where there is a lot of secure information or highly classified applications that are being deployed to the cloud. And DHS has a number of private clouds set up, but it is within their network. Not much movement within the public cloud unless it is for commodities like backup and archiving type of services. But definitely, if it's a highly classified application, I would say at the moment, the easiest transition one can make is to a private cloud. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for the webinar. We appreciate your time, and this will be the conclusion of the webinar. And please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, and we will be sending out the slide deck to the participants. Thank you, and have a good day.